If you're looking for dark, realistic horror, then this collection's got you covered. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me. Today I have a review for you of The Essential Horror of Joe R. Lansdale. This is being published by Tachyon Publications in early October 2025, and I was given a complimentary copy in exchange for an honest review, and this is a wonderful collection. You know, I think right now Joe R. Lansdale maybe is best known for his Hap and Leonard series, and Hap and Leonard, it is a contemporary crime series with like an odd couple twist, right? A black conservative gay main character and a good old boy in Texas. And in some way, that is representative of how Lansdale approaches all of his stories, that he bases them in what he sees as the depth of human character, and he takes interesting characters and then he tells stories around them. Now, he has also written a lot of horror stories over the last few decades, and this collection has stories that go from 1982 to 2020. So 4 decades worth of stories are contained in this collection. And whatever flavor of horror gets you feeling all twisty in the stomach and weak in the knees, Lansdale plays with it in this collection. I think one thing you'll see that is consistent over all of his stories is this kind of brutal naturalism or realism, where he is unflinching in the way he looks at reality. And now that is paired with the fantastic or the supernatural in some cases, not always, but he manages to even make the supernatural feel grounded in something real, right? Even his campiest stories, one of which is contained in here, they have this emotional grounding that is, like I said, unflinching is one of the best adjectives I think of when I read his writing. You could also say gritty, I suppose, but it never feels forced, right? It feels like it is honest. Now, all of his stories do feel really grounded, and I think in large part that's because he does such a good job of setting a sense of place. You know, a lot of his stories take place in the South, especially in Texas where he lives, and you can feel the atmosphere pervading the stories. He does a really good job at creating an atmosphere, creating a sense of space, and putting realistic characters in it, and then making them face really awful situations quite often. The world building and just the stories themselves can often be quite bleak, and yet they always feel at least like an honest experience or exploration of the world. Now, that world may include eldritch deities. It may include just really awful humans. It may have cults. It may have zombies. There may be post-apocalyptic plant life who is up to all sorts of shenanigans. He isn't afraid to play both with really human antagonists as well as antagonists from myth and from legend, which makes these stories all feel like they have a through line, right? They feel connected. You can tell they have the same voice behind them, yet they don't feel like the same story over and over again. He's playing in all different sorts of subgenres, and he's taking his, personal flavor and manipulating those subgenres to meet his needs. And I think it makes this collection really fun. It stands out because you can tell all the stories come from a singular voice, even though they span almost 40 years. And yet the stories are wildly diverse and have a diverse range of characters and a diverse range of even environments, settings, and supernatural or non-supernatural, antagonists that are causing a problem for whoever our protagonists seem to be. Lansdale's writing is quick, it's efficient, it's to the point. He's descriptive, and he makes sure you understand where you are and who your characters are, but he doesn't ever belabor any points. He always is moving. It feels like there is perpetual motion in all of his stories. At the same time, his stories feel really immersive. I think that's, as I said, because he does such a good job of doing world building that you can relate to these stories and to these characters, and you feel like you're there with them because he does such a good job of setting a sense of space. And now, because he isn't afraid to make his characters very specific and to locate them in very specific times and places, the characters have attitudes and behaviors, they exist in such a way sometimes that show you that the protagonist of this story isn't a hero, right? It's not always the good guy that wins. So all of these characters aren't characters you love sometimes, both in the protagonists and the antagonists of the stories, because they feel real. They feel genuine to the time and place that he's setting them. And so there is harsh language. There is, graphic and harsh treatment of people of color and of women in some of the stories, and it's not superfluous. It is because the time and place and the characters that he is talking about, this is the life they live, right? So the language isn't PC and the imagery isn't PC. Now, it isn't overly graphic as far as like horror stories go. This isn't extreme horror, but it's definitely unsettling, and it's definitely graphic in a lot of the imagery, even if it isn't over the top. But with this graphic imagery and with these very realistic exploration of what people are like in certain times and places, he still manages to very directly address ideas of racism and misogyny, abuse, trauma, power dynamics, self-awareness, and more. Like, the stories have something to say. Like, he is very explicitly going through ideas, and he is playing with them in such a way that he isn't being didactic, but it is very clear in these stories that he's working through things, and he wants to create feminist horror stories or, anti-racist horror stories. But the way he does that is to show the horrors of misogyny or the horrors of racism. So the characters and the stories themselves are complicated in that way. And that's why, in addition to unflinching being an appropriate adjective, I think very brutal and nonstop are also appropriate ways to describe a lot of Lansdale's writing. Now, at the same time, there is an element of play to his writing. One of the final stories in this collection is Bubba Hotep, and that may be one of Joe Lansdale's most famous stories. Now, most people probably know it from the movie that was starring Bruce Campbell. Don't realize that it was a short story first. It is a story of Elvis living in a retirement home, or a retirement home would be a very optimistic way to put it. It is a senior care facility, let's say. Now, of course, he says he's Elvis. Everyone else thinks that he is just an Elvis impersonator. But according to him, he got tired of the fame, so he swapped lives with an Elvis impersonator, and then that impersonator died. So now he's left living the life of this impersonator. And no one believes him, but he knows that he's really Elvis, a senior citizen Elvis. And one of his, compatriots in this senior care facility is JFK, though it's a black man who says he is JFK, but the CIA dyed his skin black because they had to put him into hiding, or whatever it is. So you have Elvis and black JFK fighting a mummy, because why not, right? So there is a high sense of camp in some of his stories. There's a sense of play. And even in that story, which sounds wild and ridiculous, there is a beating heart that feels true. He manages to inject the story about these senior citizens who may or may not be confused about the nature of reality, standing up for what they believe in and who they understand themselves to be and the world they want to live in by fighting against this mummy who may or may not be terrorizing this senior care facility. So the stories, even the ones that are ridiculous, they have a genuine sense of pathos to them. But that doesn't mean they're not fun. All of the stories are fun, even if many of them are a lot darker than Bubba Hotep. Bubba Hotep is probably the lightest and brightest of the stories in the collection. The others, not all of them, but most of them have a little bit of a darker tinge to them, yet there's always a sense of fun, even when it's located in this really gritty, bleak, realistic, 1980s Texas or something like this. You have a sense of joy reading it because he's pushing you somewhere. He's bringing you somewhere new. I'm not going to go into specifics about any of the stories in the collection, I guess, except for Bubba Hotep. But I mean, come on, Bubba Hotep always deserves a little bit of recognition. But there are 16 stories in this collection. Like I said, they cover the gamut of all different subgenres, and it is a lot of fun to read. Now, I wouldn't have minded if it was a little bit beefier of a collection. Now, some of these short stories are, long short stories. I don't think any of them none of them cross into novella categories. Some might be novelettes. I'm not quite sure, but I wouldn't have minded, another half dozen stories if this is kind of the essential horror of Joe Lansdale and it's covering 40 years. There are definitely other stories that could have been included, but with the 16 we have, they don't feel repetitive. Each one brings something new to the table, and yet they all still feel like his voice. So if you like dark, gritty, realistic horror, and if you've read other books by Joe Lansdale and you like his tone, his atmosphere, and the unflinching way that he looks at the horror of humanity and then plays with it, sometimes using the fantastic and sometimes not using the fantastic, then I think you'll definitely get a lot out of this collection. I know I enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Have any of you had a chance to read this? Have you read Joe Lansdale's other work, such as the Hap and Leonard series or any of the other many, many books he's published? I'd love to hear all of your ideas, thoughts, and comments down below. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.